Welcome to the Chris Spangle Show. I don't know, I sounded like Dracula there. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining me today. You know, we're talking tariffs today, and I feel like I'm taking crazy pills because I get on Libertarian Twitter and I am starting to see Libertarians support tariffs. So I've got somebody that has written for the Mises Institute. So we're going hardcore today. We're going old school. Back to the Mises Institute, and hopefully they're not going to let us down and go too pro-Trump. But on the issue of tariffs, Matt Cookson is very, very good. So we are going to talk a little bit about tariffs and their impact on the economy, and really whose responsibility are tariffs. I actually was surprised by this because the president has always been the one that puts the tariffs in place, but it's actually delegated to Congress in the Constitution. And they gave the power up to the president. We'll tell you when. We'll tell you which scoundrel of the Constitution did this. We'll tell you how Congress can take it back. And we'll talk about whether or not they will or not. So, yeah, check out the article in the show notes. Congress needs to be jealous of its tariff power. Matthew Cookson is a contributor and a Middle East history and policy fellow with Young Voices. He also works in the supply chain, which is very important in terms of tariffs. As for a U.S. defense contractor. So, Matthew, his commentary has appeared in Real Clear Politics, The American Thinker, China Source, and the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And so it was a real joy to talk to him about tariffs and to hear a solid libertarian opinion on them. And he refutes some things that past guests have said. So stay tuned. You're going to learn a lot right here with Matt Cookson. Matt, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me out.
So let's talk tariffs. I don't know. I feel crazy. Sometimes I'm talking to libertarians lately and they're supporting tariffs, and I see an article from the Mises Institute on Mises Wire. Then, all right, I was glad. I knew it was going to be rock solid libertarian stuff. And the article is titled, "The Congress Needs to Be Jealous of Its Tariff Powers." Yeah. So why don't we start with why the Constitution originally placed the power to set tariffs in the hands of Congress rather than the executive branch. And then we'll talk about how it all went wrong.
Yeah, so the reason that tariffs are placed in the hands of Congress is because it is meant to be the deliberative and legislative body. Congress did not mean for taxation or any type of law to get passed flippantly or without careful consideration. And that's what the thinking is in placing that power in the hands of Congress.
So when did it become the purview of the executive?
It happened early in the 20th century in the Roosevelt administration. It sort of became clear that tariffs had stopped being a matter of taxation policy and had become a political issue where senators would use them as a way of benefiting their constituency, and they've become a sort of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours sort of thing. So, for example, if the senator of Maine didn't want lobsters imported, he might go to the senator from Georgia and say, hey, I know you don't want soda imported, so maybe we can agree to lump all these tariffs together and get tariffs passed. And the legislative Congress basically said, we can't be trusted with this power. It's too politicized. Here, Mr. President, you take it.
Or, yeah. And now we have an MMA boxer from Ireland saying, do what I want or else I'll have my friend tariff you. It's just sort of crazy. So they're often presented as protective measures, you know, for domestic industries. Like I'm literally sitting here and I saw a notification that we have put a 25% tariff on imported cars. What do you think the negative impacts are when we put a tariff in? What is a tariff? Is it not a tax? Is it a tax? Let's go there.
Well, it absolutely is a tax. You heard President Trump announce tariffs on a variety of goods so far in his administration, and he's announced them in the forms of there be a 25% tariff on steel imports, for example. So that, by its very nature, means that any steel that is brought into the United States has a tax placed on it of 25%. And the reason this harms consumers is because it, one, it does increase the cost of these goods that are getting imported, and also it makes domestic industries less competitive by shielding them from the competition of international suppliers.
Hmm. So he puts this tariff on auto workers. How does that in practical terms roll out? You talked a little bit about, like, specifically, how do consumers end up paying more when the president puts a tariff like that on?
Well, so for something like cars, conceptually, it might be easy to think about tariffs as maybe a one-time occurrence. Like if you import avocados from Mexico, it'll be a one-time tariff placed on the good, and that'll be that. Goods will be more expensive when you go to shop for them at the grocery store. But for something as complicated as a car, cars aren't just manufactured in one place using goods from one place. They're very complex. There's literally thousands of parts that go into them. And for some of these cars that are manufactured in North America, a car or its part may cross an international border 8 times throughout the manufacturing process. And each time a tariff will get slapped onto that good. And it's a snowball effect, especially for these raw materials like steel or various other materials. And that cost gets rolled up deeper into the chain until eventually it's passed on to the consumer.
Yeah, I mean, tariffs have kind of a dark history in American economics. He's talked glowingly about President McKinley recently. McKinley puts in tariffs and causes an economic crisis. Obviously, Smoot-Hawley right before the crash of, historically, tease that out. I mean, what could we be facing as the president starts to add in a lot of tariffs, especially with the amount of debt that we have?
Yeah, well, it's certainly not good considering the uneasy economy we're coming out of the Biden administration. The economy is really something that President Trump needs to get hot on. It's the bread and butter issue that he was elected on. As James Carville would say, it's the economy, stupid. And when you're in a precarious economic situation like we are, the last thing you need to do is to be slapping additional uncertainties and costs into the economy. And moreover, there are diplomatic consequences to these tariffs, especially if we're placing them on countries that are official allies of ours, like Canada and the EU. I'm sympathetic to the argument that these countries place some tariffs on our exports. However, I don't think that the way to resolve that is to, shoot yourself in the foot to spite your face.
So I'd love your opinion on this, because we had a guest recently who is a Cuban immigrant who fled communism there, and she was I'm not going to say she was not pro-Trump. She wasn't necessarily pro-tariff, but she made the argument that, look, globalism and free trade has to have its limits with a country like Cuba that has human rights violations, sends people into our country to disrupt our country, supports terrorism, right? That you can't just have pure free trade. All that does is that benefits the dictators at the top. What would you make of that argument and her assessment?
I'm sympathetic to it in the sense that I do see that there are occasionally national security reasons in which tariffs may be practical. For example, in dealing with a nation like Cuba or China that views us as an existential threat. However, I don't agree with the assessment that just because in an extreme case they might be useful, that they are a practically beneficial tool, because most nations in the world aren't existential threats to the United States or dictators who wish to see us harm. And I think we need to bear that in mind when we're setting tariffs on countries that are not dictatorial enemies of the United States, like Canada and the European Union.
So let's talk a little bit about precedent. One of the reasons I think Trump loves these tariffs is that it's one of the few hard powers that the president seems to have. Most things are delegated through Congress. There's checks and balances from the judicial branch. But you take, I think, the most instructive moment so far of how Trump thinks about tariffs was the Colombian exchange, not the famous one, but where Trump started sending planes with immigrants back to Colombia. And the Colombian president said, we won't stand for this. And so Trump threatened tariffs on the president of Colombia. And the president of Colombia's response was, I'll send my plane. And I think it seems to be the president wielding some power to get pieces of his agenda done. I could see that frustration, from Bush, Obama on, right? Especially Obama on. There's just been this total lack of ability to get anything done in Congress. So I could see why a president would want to do that. But moving forward, do you think more presidents will wield this power the way that Trump has, or is Trump just sort of Trump?
Well, I think it's easy to look at a guy like Trump, who's a very unpredictable personality and very easy to caricature in a lot of ways. However, I think when it comes to the presidency, once that cat is out of the bag with regard to any political power, it's only a matter of time until the next guy uses it to further his own agenda. I don't think that it'll be easy to put that cat back in the bag unless Congress reasserts itself and demands the return of its constitutionally prescribed duty. I think so long as that power is out there for the president to legally use, the president, whoever it is, can and will use it.
So how do we rein in this power? What can Congress start to do to claw it back?
Yeah, there are a number of things that Congress can do. One is to simply pass a law that repeals the 1934 Reciprocal Tariffs Act that says that this is our power according to the Constitution, and we're taking it back. There's really not much the president could do to stop that, especially if there is the sufficient majority. And also, it speaks to a broader problem of the executive accumulating power over the past several decades, really. And one of the things that Congress could do to solve that is pass something like the REINS Act, which was put forward back in 2023. And what that would do was subject all executive agency rules valued to have an economic impact of $100 million or more to approval from Congress. And I think that doing things like that to rein in the power of the administrative state would be hugely beneficial in restoring our constitutional order.
Now, one thing you did in this article, and I love it, it's a stroke of genius, if I can say so, Matt. So you appealed to the president's vanity. You mentioned his economic legacy might benefit if Congress took back tariff-setting powers. Can you elaborate on why predictability in tariff policies would benefit economic stability and therefore his legacy?
Sure. So, and yeah, you're absolutely right. That when it comes to setting economic policy, businesses depend on predictability. They don't like uncertainty in the market. The stock markets hate it because businesses, when they're planning setting their long-term strategy, they're not just thinking, oh, what's the market going to look like tomorrow or next week? They're thinking, what is the market going to be like in 6 months or a year or 5 years from now? And when you have a president who, is so flippant in terms of how he sets tariffs, it makes life very difficult. As someone who works in supply chain, I can tell you that we like to have predictability baked into our job. We don't like the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to come next.
So, I mean, I'm not going to hold my breath until Congress takes these powers back, but what do you think the likelihood? Is there any rumblings in Congress that, if the Democrats get a majority, maybe we can take this power back? Are there some good and honest, decent Republicans left that might want to take this power back? Where are we at in terms of plausibility for your...
Oh, boy.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Matt.
Yeah, you've brought out my cynical side. It seems that each of the political parties only seems to care about these types of things when the other side is in the majority, which is unfortunate because this is something that can be wielded against both sides. And unfortunately, it seems that many members of Congress seem to care about scoring their next big media appearance or book deal or podcast, and throwing some meat to their base than they do about keeping and upholding the Constitution like they swore an oath to do, unfortunately.
All right, Matt. Well, this has been very instructive. What else should, before we wrap up, there's probably something that I just don't know to ask you that is really important on this topic. What is that?
Yeah, I think we touched on it a little bit, but I think the overall theme that Congress is derelicting its duty to be the sole legislative body of our country. We see that, of course, as I mentioned in this article with tariffs, but overall, Congress has abdicated enormous responsibility in terms of setting legislative, action. Thousands upon thousands of regulations and rules get passed every year by administrative agencies like the EPA that Congress has pretty much no say over. These agencies are executive agencies. Their heads are appointed by the president, but Congress has no say in the passing of these rules. And I think it's hugely important that Congress reasserts itself and reclaims the legislative duty that the Constitution says solely belongs to Congress.
All right, Matt Cookson, where can people follow you?
They can find me on X at Matt Cookson95. I post my articles on there and occasionally comment and express my opinions on the news of the day.
All right, Matt, thanks so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
And thank you for joining us. If you learned something today, then the best way to help this podcast and everyone you love is by sharing it on social media, sharing it with a friend. Hit that Spotify share to your Instagram stories button. Man, that really helps a lot. So thanks so much for joining us here on the Chris Spangle Show.